So it's my great pleasure to invite Nancy Ševčenko to deliver the 18th ICMA at the Courtauld lecture this evening, titled All in the Family, the Byzantine Imperial Family of the Comnenians as Patrons in the first half of the 12th century. So please join me in welcoming Nancy.
So it's cheeky and in fact very foolish of me to be coming to London to speak about the Comnenians. For the United Kingdom has been a hotbed, let's say, of Comnenian studies for some time, and I need only mention the Courtauld's own, Robin Cormack and John Loudon, but there are many others working in this area. The superb work of Paul Magdaleno on Emperor Manuel I and the cultural scene in the second half of the 12th century inspired me to look more closely at what was going on in the far less documented first half, under the first two Comnenian emperors, Alexius I and John II, that is from 1081 to 1143. When we think of the Comnenians, we think primarily of the military aristocracy under Alexius Komnenos that took over the government of the Byzantine Empire in 1081. Members of this powerful family then ruled Constantinople for roughly 100 years into the late 12th century. Alexius I ruled for 37 years. I tried to make some of these little charts for you, and some of them worked and some of them didn't, but at any rate, here's the basic formula. So Alexius ruled for 37 years, and that's an exceptionally long reign for any emperor of Byzantium. His firstborn son, John Comnenus, became emperor at the death of Alexius I in 1118, and ruled as John II for another 25 years. Then John's son Manuel took over and ruled for another 37 years until 1180. And beyond the great royal line of succession just outlined, there were, of course, a large number of lesser Comnenians. The emperor's brothers and his sisters and his cousins and his aunts, to quote Gilbert and Sullivan, and then remembers them. Alexius had 9 children. John II himself had 8. Adding up all the children of their children, I estimate that Alexius I must have had at least 39 grandchildren. And I promise I won't recount their story, each one's story today. The Comnenian emperors kept this famille nombreuse close, and for the most part loyal, by filling the administration with sons and sons-in-law and giving the family members special titles. A new hierarchy was established based on proximity to the imperial throne. One's title indicated immediately just how close any member of the family was to the emperor. The first son, for example, was called Caesar, Caesar. Younger sons, brothers, and other close relatives were called Sebastocrator, and their wives Sebastocratorisa, or Lady Sebastocrator. Although few of their commissions survive today, written evidence informs us of the existence of other works that have not survived. Because the Comnenians were a very literary-minded group, much of our information about their patronage comes from a spectrum of written sources: archival documents, letters, poems and encomia, historical chronicles, philosophical treatises, and so forth. Pretty well the gamut of literary forms in the 12th century. And I am well aware how risky it is to draw conclusions based on such sparse and scattered evidence. So I will merely share with you here certain patterns of donation that I have observed in studying this material. So who was doing what in the first generations of imperial Comneni, by whom I mean the emperors Alexius I and John II, their wives, both of whom were named Irene, and this gets very confusing, and their sons and daughters. And I'm only looking here at the direct line of descent from Alexius. I will then look at a nonconformist in the family and at the ways in which his patronage differs from theirs. First to Alexius I himself. Unlike emperors before and after him, the Emperor Alexius initiated no monastery foundation on his own in Constantinople, but supported one, the monastery of Christ Philanthropos, with his wife Irini Dukena. And about this double monastery I'll speak more later. His main interest lay with an ambitious social welfare project known as the Orphanotrophion, a vast complex, a city within a city, it was said, devoted to the care of the blind, the lame, paralytics, the mutilated and the maimed, the elderly and the poor, and to the schooling of orphans. He endowed the Orphanotrophion with vast estates for its provisioning and maintenance, and hired a huge staff to administer it. We don't know much of anything about what it looked like. The only other major project of Alexius that we hear of is a renovation of the throne room, the Triklinos, in the imperial palace of the Vlakerne. None of these buildings survives, and with the exception of the Orphanotrophion, as I say, we know rather little about them. But we do have a portrait, or rather a pair of portraits, of Alexius from around 1100 in a manuscript whose contents he commissioned. The text is a collection known as the Panoplia Dogmatiki of treatises against heresies that was assembled at Alexius's request by the theologian Ephemios Digabinos. There are about 70 surviving manuscript copies of this text, but only 2 of them are illustrated. One now in the Vatican, which is the one you see, and the other in Moscow. On 3 pages at the beginning of the Vatican manuscript, we see first a line of 9 famous church fathers, each identified by name, holding their writings on scrolls and facing toward an image of Alexius on the opposite page. Alexius is apparently receiving the writings of these theologians, and for this undertaking he is acknowledged and blessed by Christ. On the reverse of this very folio, that is folio 2V, we see Alexius now in full imperial garb, approaching, is this buzzing me? Am I making this buzzing?
You're a bit too close to the microphone.
Too close, thank you. He's now in full imperial garb and approaching the seated Christ and offering him the volume, almost as though somewhere between the recto and the verso of folio 2, Alexius had been transported from earth into the heavenly sphere. Above each miniature is a 4-line verse. On folio 1V, the fathers offer their works to, quote, the one that wears the crown. On folio 2R is Alexius's response to them, and on folio 2V, the one here, the words of Christ to Alexius. The miniatures make the emperor's role as patron very clear. He receives the writings and offers them in the form of a codex to Christ. But this third miniature has more to say. First, Alexius is depicted on essentially the same scale as Christ, granted that Christ is seated and would be taller if he were to stand up. Their halos are on the same level, and they look each other in the eye, man to man, if I dare say so, without heresy. But nowhere is there any acknowledgement of the lesser status of Alexius. Both hold books. Christ holds the Gospels, while Alexius holds a book created to refute any false interpretation of these Gospels. Secondly, the words above the miniature are spoken by Christ himself, who says to him, "Many emperors have performed powerful deeds, but you exceed them all in deed and word. My almighty right hand gives you strength. Carry on, reign, and live forever." That Christ speaks directly to the emperor is really startling, for to my knowledge, Christ does not speak directly to mortals except in illustrations of the New Testament. And Christ's words, zon aeonios, live eternally, all but guarantee Alexius's eternal life. A message strengthened by the seated Christ, here evoking the Christ of the Last Judgment, and the message and the fact that Christ's blessing hand just happens to be pointing straight up to his words as though to reinforce them. Note, too, that the figure of Alexius in both miniatures, The dark-lined face with dark raised eyebrows and a squarish beard identifies Alexius as a Comnenian, even without his being named, as we shall see. This page is not an abstract statement of principle that the emperor is Christ's representative, but shows that it is this particular emperor, Alexius I Komnenos, who is here being rewarded for the anti-heretical treatises that he has collected. All in all, a revealing statement of Alexius's view of himself as the designated defender of orthodoxy. And we hear of other similar commissions by Alexius, but we don't know anything much about them, with one exception. His musae, the muses, a sort of farewell letter in verse to his son John that dwelt on the proper use of power, the need for justice and virtue, and the need for a full treasury from which to buy off his enemies. So Alexius may not have been an active patron of the visual arts, but he was certainly busy giving things away. To monasteries outside the capital, he primarily donated landed estates and privileges, such as freedom from taxation. I have found no hard evidence of Alexius having given actual objects to any monastery, but he supplied lavish gifts to potential allies or enemies. At the very beginning of his reign, early in the year 1082, he sent to the German Emperor Henry IV 2,000 pounds of gold coin and 100 silken garments, and promised there would be 3,000 additional pounds of gold coming if Henry signed an oath to assist the Byzantines in South Italy against Robert Guiscard, the Norman ruler who was threatening the empire from the west. And in the same letter, Alexius offers Henry, as a mark of friendship, a gold encolpion, which is a sort of pectoral cross, set with pearls, a gilded box, or fici, containing relics of various saints, each of whom was identified on an accompanying piece of paper, a sardonyx chalice, and a crystal goblet, a special stone called a thunderbolt, maybe a bloodstone, set in gold, and some opobalsamon, which is balsam balm, the balm of Gilead. So there are two categories of gifts here, clearly differentiated from each other. The emperor gets the coins and silk in his official capacity, but seems to be receiving the odd precious objects, both sacred and secular, for his own use, quote, as Alexius says, as a mark of friendship. In Constantinople itself, Alexius used gifts for dramatic effect, as in the case of the Crusader Bohemond. As related by Alexius's daughter Anna, quote, the emperor summoned Bohemond and required of him that he take the customary Latin oath. After the ceremony was over, the emperor set aside a room in the palace and had the floor covered with all kinds of wealth, clothes, gold, and silver coins and objects of lesser value, filled the place so completely that it was impossible for anybody to even walk in it. He ordered the man assigned to show Bohemond these riches to open the doors all of a sudden. All this, said the man, is yours today, a present from the emperor. We have other reports of Alexius's gift to foreign rulers, but without indication of the nature of the gifts. If these gifts were repeated on this scale over time, it's easy to see how the imperial treasury could be depleted and how the Crusaders could perceive Constantinople as a source of infinite riches. Among diplomatic gifts, a piece of the true cross in its box, Stavro Fici, was presumably the most valued. But although a Western writer claims that Alexius included a Stavro Fici among the gifts that he sent to this Emperor Henry IV, Anna Komneni, who is our Byzantine source on the nature of these gifts, did not include a Stavro Fici on her list. And in fact, I have found no reliable source to show that Alexius was ready to offer this important a gift to anyone outside the family. Many other kings and monasteries claimed, and still claim today, to possess gifts from Alexius. But in fact, I've found no evidence to corroborate the claims, and some of the crucibles and documents are actually forgeries. To be sure, Alexius awarded the monk Christodulus the whole island of Patmos on which to establish a monastery, and sent a crucible to that effect in 1088, but neither in the crucible nor in the detailed life of Christodulus is there any mention of any other imperial gifts. Nonetheless, we should keep in mind that Alexius was sending silk garments, altar cloths, and money westward to successive abbots of Monte Cassino in Italy and to the Cathedral of Pisa, and liturgical furnishings to the Montefalco of Skemer, the founder of the Italian monastery of Santa Maria del Patira near Rossano in Calabria. Politically savvy gifts, we might say. But in general, Alexius I is known for the very opposite of giving. To pay for the war effort that confronted him immediately upon his accession to the throne, he first turned to his close relatives. And these, says Anna Comnena, quote, first collected their own available resources in the form of gold and silver objects and sent them to the imperial mint. But then Alexius started requisitioning and melting down the contents of church treasuries. This blurring of the line between private and public property created great antagonism in the capital, and Alexius was forced to desist. It is possibly remorse on his part for the violence that attended his takeover of the capital in 1081, as well as for this expropriation of church treasures, that led to a scene of the Last Judgment being painted in the palace that had Alexius himself in the composition, pleading from hell. Now, we'll turn to, yes, she's in red, to the wife of Alexius I, Irene Lucena. It was she who founded the convent of the Virgin Cecaritomeni around the years 1110 to 1116 as a pendant to the male monastery of Christ Philanthropos. It was to serve as a comfortable place of retirement and ultimately a place of burial for her, her daughters, and other female relatives, with no requirement that they become nuns. Neither the Virgin Cecaritomeni nor the Christ Philanthropos exist today, but one of the original manuscripts of the Typikon, or foundation document of the Virgin Convent, has been found. And you can see, this is the really the official end of the manuscript. Here where the writing changes is her actual, very awkward signature. Iurini Christotofeo Pisti Vasilisou. Sorry, Tom Romayon Ivukena. So her first name in the beginning and her maiden name, so to speak, at the end. It provides us with a great deal of information on the administration of the convent, its liturgical practices and burials. There was also a most valuable inventory of its possessions, both immovable and movable. What the inventory of the convent of the Virgin Cecaritomeni shows is that it owned 3 stavrothecae, that is, containers for a relic of the true cross. One of these was inscribed with a poem stating clearly that Irene was devoting it to the Virgin Cecaritomeni. This stavrothecae apparently had little silver boxes within it that were adorned with passion scenes. Another stavrothecae in the inventory was inscribed with lines of verse crediting Irene and referring to her husband and children. The third stavrothecae in the inventory had a crucifixion on the cover and a lot of other decoration, but no verses and no specific connection with Irene. The inventory mentions a reliquary of St. Demetrius, 25 icons, including some small silver ones, and many other objects, but none of the other ones is associated with Irene. From another poem, we learned that Irene adorned yet another stavrothecae. This makes a total so far of 3 stavrothecae directly associated with Irene, all of them lost. However, one further stavrothecae does survive, and it gives us some idea of the reliquaries that bore her name. It's a small cross now in the treasury of San Marco in Venice that contains 2 pieces of the wood of the true cross. The setting is of the 16th century, but the silver tips of the cross are inscribed tightly with a rather touching poem of 17 lines of verse, and they revealed Irene as its donor. And you can see somewhat her name in here, the second line, really. The poem was evidently written toward the end of her life, when, as she says, she has exchanged the imperial robes for the dusky ones of a nun. The cross is small, about 8 by 5, which is really the size of a little index card, and seems surprisingly modest and personal. But then Irene had been a dowager empress for many years. She died somewhere around 1133, having long survived her husband Alexius, who had died in 1118. And we know little about the circumstances in which she lived during that period. This Stavrothiki may well have been given to the Kekaritomeni, but that is where Irene was to be buried. So for her, we have a large double monastic foundation, half of it designed to accommodate her female relatives, and 4 Stavrothiki, at least 2 of which are known to have ended up in the possession of the convent. The contrast between the 2 levels of patronage is striking. And there's only one other object that bears her name that I will speak about later. By the time of her death, her son John had already been ruling as emperor for 15 years. His main foundation was the great monastery of Christ Pantocrator, started by John's wife, a Hungarian princess called Irene Piroshka. This is a nice old view. It doesn't look like that anymore. But with the full collaboration of her husband. And here's today. About the Pantocrator we are well informed, since all 3 adjoining churches of the monastery survive in Istanbul today, as has its typikon, the monastery's foundation document, along with later material, including poetry and liturgical texts celebrating the anniversary of its dedication. It's just a plan for you. The churches have been well studied, and I won't go into detail about them today, except to stress that the monastery, with its hospital, its old age home, and its leper sanatorium, had a serious civic function, more reminiscent of the Orphanotrophion, alongside its dynastic one, designed as it was to be a place of burial for Canadian emperors, starting with John II himself. Very little is left of the original decoration, other than the marble sheathing of the walls, plus an opus sectile floor, some fragments of mosaic in the window soffits, and a few pieces of stained glass. We can only begin to imagine the wealth of lamps, chandeliers, icons, and the light that must have been provided. But the inventory of the Pantocrator monastery, unfortunately, lists only its monastery, the monastery's land holdings, not its movable possessions. But we learn from a poem by the poet Kallikis that John brought home an icon of Christ from one of his campaigns, had it adorned with gold and gems, and dedicated it to the Pantocrator monastery. From a different poet, we learn that John adorned an icon of Christ with a silver and gold revetment. And whether this is the same icon is impossible to determine. John had also apparently adorned an icon of the Virgin Hortigitria with gems and pearls, but what he did with that icon, we don't know. There were other objects acquired in the course of his campaigns that he managed to bring home to the capital. We hear of an icon of the Virgin acquired by John at the time of his capture of the town of Anazarbos in Asia Minor, and the silver or silver revetted icon of the Virgin, which for John's triumphal return to Constantinople in 1133 rode upon a chariot while John walked behind. Occasionally, too, treasures lost to the foe in some prior campaign were reclaimed. To persuade John to relieve the siege of the Syrian fortress of Shazar in 1138, for example, the emir of Shazar volunteered to give back to John the grand processional cross set with rubies that had been lost by Emperor Romanos Diogenes at the terrible Battle of Manzikert in 1071. In this period, we're talking about John II, we begin to encounter a number of family portraits. The most impressive of these is that in the Church of St. Sophia, where in a large scale, I'm sure you all are familiar with this one, in a large-scale mosaic we see John, Irene, and their son Alexius, who was named after his grandfather Alexius I. And that's where he is in line, anyway. Young Alexius had been crowned co-emperor with his father and was slated to succeed him. However, the prince died in his late 30s, a year before his father, so the optimism and clear line of succession conveyed by these dynastic portraits was not to be fulfilled. The mosaic must have been executed sometime between 1122, when Alexius was crowned co-emperor, and the death of Alexius 20 years later in 1142. The figures are all standing, John on the Virgin's right, almost as tall as she, being blessed by the child Christ, who is clasped in the Virgin's arms, and Empress Irene Piroshka, John's wife, on the Virgin's left, looking their way. Their son Alexius, though clad almost identically to his father, stands at a slight distance, at right angles to the mosaic of his parents, though his elbow reaches into their space, as does his inscription. You can see that in his inscription. It comes down there, one part of it. The mother and son have green halos, where John's is blue and the Virgin's is red. The philanthropic role of the emperor in donating to the church is made evident by his money bag, but at the same time, the equality in scale between all the figures here, human and divine, stresses the emperor's unparalleled access to the Virgin and child. Though this is in St. Sophia, the mosaic, no patriarch is ever depicted that close. That John and his son were both porphyrogenitus, that means born in purple, in the palace, while your father was an emperor, still emperor. With this term, this was evidently deemed of great significance. You can see that the word is given more space and clarity than any of the other imperial titles for John, even that of Autocrator of the Romans, and serves to proclaim the unbroken succession of father, son, and grandson. And so the porphyrogenitus is what comes down there, and then for Alexius it comes down there, near between him and his mother. And the distinctive features of John, which echo those of Alexius in the Vatican manuscript, serve to reinforce the message. The theme of unbroken succession, conveyed here, was also conveyed by this miniature that prefaces a luxury gospel book now in the Vatican Library. Here we see John II and his young son Alexius again, being blessed by Christ, who is seated above them. Irene is absent. Christ is flanked by the crowned personifications of two virtues, mercy on the left and justice on the right, forming as it were the back of his throne and murmuring in his ear. Once again, young Alexius is the mirror image of his father, except that his shoes are not red. And his inscription is also identical to that of his father, lacking only the phrase autocrator ton Romaion. And the wording is identical to that as it was in St. Sophia, with the word porphyrogenitus again taking precedence over autocrator of the Romaion, the komninos. Again, the similarity in the features of the various members of the family is used to reinforce the closeness of their relationship. The miniature and the manuscript prefaces has been dated to around 1122, when Alexius was made co-emperor with his father, on the assumption that what we are seeing is a scene of coronation. But this reading has been challenged, and Christ is now thought to be blessing the union of the two emperors rather than crowning them, which leaves open a wider time frame for the execution of the miniature, and which is likely to have been a gift from father to son. The fact that Christ is flanked by mercy and justice, attributes that should ideally characterize the reign of any Byzantine emperor, leads me to wonder whether this frontispiece to the Gospel book is meant to serve as a sort of mirror of princes, a message from the imperial father to his imperial son. And in this regard, it's interesting to note that a later 14th century hand wrote out in the very front of the manuscript the preface to the Musae, that was the Muses, the poem which Alexius I is offering his advice to his son John II. This edition does suggest that the frontispiece may have been being read in this way in the 14th century. Also interesting is the first initial on the page opposite the nativity scene and under the figure of the evangelist Matthew. Here the image of Eleemosini, the initial there, that is Mercy, grasps a flourishing vine to form the capital letter B, but this time the personification is crowned and in imperial dress. She has long braids, ropes really, of reddish hair, as does Irene in the St. Sophia mosaic. And so it has been suggested by Spatarakis that this is possibly Irene Piroshka herself participating in the gift to their son. And I have no objection to that theory. And this brings us to one more portrait, that of the Empress Irene on an enamel plaque that is built into the famous Polidoro in Venice. The figure, I'm sorry, she is the one here. Labeled, well labeled, clearly labeled. The figure is definitely Byzantine, and she is named the Augusta. But is this Irene Dukena, the wife of Alexius I, or Irene Piroshka, the wife of John II? None of the evidence we have tilts the argument significantly in favor of one or the other, but the tradition that the Byzantine enamels of the Polidoro were taken from the monastery of Pantocrator suggests that the panel is to be identified as Irene Piroshka, the monastery's co-founder. The original Byzantine context for this enamel panel eludes us. It was surely made while Irene was empress, because an empress loses the title Augusta after her husband's death, and might have been paired with a portrait of her husband to celebrate some kind of donation. At any rate, it does fit in with the relevance of imperial portraiture during the reign of John II. And yet another example of this interest in family portraiture, excuse me one sec, I have a close-up of Irene, and again a comparison though. Irene has a red hair, but she has dark hair. What that means. Another example of the interest in family portraiture is the portrait of John II that was apparently commissioned by his unreliable younger brother Isaac at the time of their reconciliation. In the poem by Prof, devoted to the prom portrait, Isaac says that, quote, as earlier I had painted you in the center of my heart, I now set you up and depict you with the hand of a painter, stilose και γράφωσε χειρίζογράφου, so that I can always see you and be with you, staring at the copy as if it were the original. Almost sounds as if someone clasping a photograph. The strong emphasis on their common childhood and family ties suggests the possibility of a joint portrait, a pairing of the two brothers that would have resembled the miniature we've seen of John and his son Alexius. The verb stylon suggests a freestanding panel, and we do know that Isaac owned stela, or panels, with portraits of his parents. I'm not aware of parallels for such secular icons, we might almost say, but the wording could suggest that the images of family, unity, and cohesion that we have seen in mosaic and in manuscript form might have been found on panel painting as well. John II, like his father Alexius, was periodically giving away imperial treasures to foreign rulers whom he hoped to draw to his side. Among the most spectacular documents, though it has not yet been properly published, are John's two letters to Pope Innocent II regarding the union of the churches, dated 1139-1141, that is, toward the end of John's reign, and the two letters remain in the Vatican archives. Both documents, which are bilingual Greek and Latin, are written entirely in large gold letters on purple parchment, And in the letter of 1141, the text is framed to left and right by illuminated ornament and also has a big headpiece, which is not in this photo. But you must think of the gold on purple at this point. These letters to the Pope are unlike any other imperial document of the period, as far as I know, in their luxury. Each one was clearly meant to be a precious gift in itself. But the letters did not arrive in isolation. In the one of 1141, John lists gifts he is sending to accompany the letter. They include 12 large samite silks, which is a very precious silk, with large letters on them, 24 belted outer garments, 2 textiles decorated with 40 bands, etc. They're quite carefully described. In all, 56 silks, presumably for liturgical use in Rome. So, although the 2 emperors, Alexius I and John I, spent much of their reigns on campaign, their building activities in Constantinople, done in cooperation with their wives, was considerable. 3 large new monasteries and the revival of the Orpheon. Their smaller commissions, at least the ones that we know of, were less innovative and consisted primarily of adding precious materials to already existent icons. Even the Stavrothiki, inscribed with verses, were essentially garnishing an older object. As we saw, Alexius early on sent to this foreign ruler, Henry IV of Germany, the special luxury items, reliquaries, incopia, cups, and such. But I suspect these objects were not recently created for the occasion, but rather came from the church treasuries Alexius was raiding at the time. Later he, and John II as well, limit their gifts to items of silk, silk being apparently produced in Constantinopolitan workshops in great quantities and thus readily available upon demand without public protest. Now we turn to their children. Cultural activity among this group, though they were positioned so close to the throne, seems to have been limited, with few exceptions, to literary output and literary salons. The eldest child of Alexius was Anna Komnena, whose only, albeit impressive and valuable legacy, was the Alexiad, the biography of her adored father, written after she had retired to the Caecali Domeni convent, probably in the 1140s. Her younger sister, Maria, embellished a Stavrothiki that still exists, remounted in a church in the town of Ina, I think that's how you pronounce it, Ina, in Belgium. It's absolutely tiny, about the size of a 3x5 index card. This one is even smaller, just like that. So this one is the nicer one, as you can see, but all of the rest of the gold is of course later. And that's the interior of the actual cross. The inscription is written down the back side of the cross. The front of the cross is sheathed in gold, and the ends of the arms are covered with pieces of gold with an etched decoration filled with enamel. Maria is offering these fragments of the 2 cross to the all-hymned Virgin. She is not identified as a Komnena, but merely as a Porphyrogenita. But it's generally accepted that this humble Semni, Porphyrogenita Maria, is the second daughter of Emperor Alexius I and Irene Duquesne. The cross, clearly a personal item, may have ended up in the Caecali Domeni. Maria was slated to become the administrator of the monastery upon the death of her sister Anna, but there's no evidence that she became a nun there herself, and in fact we know she was married and bore 6 children. In the Typicon written by her mother Irene, Maria is given the right, along with her sister, to dine with the nuns at the Caecali Domeni, providing she doesn't bring along more than 2 or 3 of her female attendants. Now, going down the line, the next child was John, who was to become John the Second. I'm sorry, this one's skipping ahead a little bit. What we know of his role of patron has already been discussed. Next came Andronicus, so please keep to the top line there. We know virtually nothing about Andronicus except that he may have married a Russian princess. Next was Alexius's third son and fifth child, Isaac Comnenus Sebastocrator, the problem child, about whom I will speak at greater length later. Next came Eudokia, their third daughter, who was married to a husband so disrespectful, so abusive to her, that her mother plucked her out of the marriage and installed her as a nun in the Kefalitomeni. Yet we have a little evidence for Eudokia's patronage. Poems by the poet Callicles tells us that she gave a chalice to her father, and she too embellished the Stavrothiki cross. In the poem that was inscribed on the cross, she doesn't call herself a Komnene either, just a Porphyrogenita. For the female Komnenians of this generation, it seemed that the family name carried less weight than did the fact of their imperial birth. And of the patronage of Alexius as Irene's seventh child, Theodora, we know nothing, although it was her son Alexius, you may be interested to know, who in 1164 established the Church of St. Pantaleon at Nerezi outside of Skopje, well known to all Byzantinists for its frescoes. The final two children of Alexius, named Manuel and Zoe, died in infancy, and all of these children were born in a 15-year period, so Irene was clearly pretty tired by then. For this generation, then, the children of Alexius I and Irene, evidence of patronage is slim. Two of their daughters, Maria and Evdokia, owned small Stavrothiki, which they embellished with gold, presumably for their own use. That there are in all 6 Stavrothiki mentioned in connection with the wife and daughters of Alexius suggests to me that perhaps Alexius himself was giving the female members of his immediate family fragments of the true cross, which they then adorned individually according to their means. With the exception then of John II, who became emperor, and his brother Isaac, this generation, male and female, was quiet. To be sure, the retreats and burial places for these children, whether at the Kefalitomeni or the Pantocrator, had been assured by the activities of their parents and or brother John, leaving no need, even had it been possible, for any of them to start their own monastic foundation. And the daughters, some of them anyway, had presumably been absorbed through marriage into the aristocracy. At the same time, it is apparent that there was a divide between the resources and ambitions of the emperor and empress and their children. The former identified themselves with the state and the city, took freely from it and gave to it. The children concentrated, if at all, on intellectual matters and not on the arts. Among the next generation, that of the children of John II, the adornment of small Stavrothiki, probably for personal use, seems to have given way to the donation of textiles, especially altar cloths, to specific Constantinopolitan sanctuaries. John II's second daughter, Anna, gave an altar cloth to the studious monastery, perhaps the first gift of a made-to-order object that we have yet encountered. Altar cloths and icon veils were given in profusion by the widow of Andronicus, the second of John's sons. She gave at least 6 of the latter to different virgin churches throughout the city. This widow was the famous Irene Sebastocratorisa, about whom much has been written in recent years. This is the widow of Andronicus. Among many a literary venture, she is also thought to have commissioned the 2 incredibly luxurious manuscripts of the homilies of James Pokinavaphos. Anna, John's second daughter, again, gave not only the altar cloth just mentioned, but also adorned the head of St. Stephen, a major relic, I would assume, with a crown of gold and silver. She says that the saint, who was of course stoned to death, hadn't had enough of stones, so there were to be no gems in this crown. Anna's husband, in fact, had been killed in battle by a stone hurled from a catapult, So her adornment of an icon of St. Stephen in his memory was apt. The taste among this generation for textiles is something quite new. Were they simply cheaper than icon revetments? Were churches suddenly crying for more altar cloths and icon veils? At this point, we simply don't know. At any rate, the interest in donating liturgical textiles is new and represents a more outgoing form of patronage. As for the other children of John II, his third daughter, Theodora, inscribed an icon of the Virgin with a prayer that she become pregnant. And in fact, the dedications we encounter in this generation reflect personal concerns more often than earlier. An appeal to become pregnant, an appeal for a sick child to be healed, and so forth. The last son of John II, Manuel, who was the only porphyrogenitus of the lot, in other words, all the other children were born before John became emperor, he was to become the Emperor Manuel I. And there I will stop, as so much about Manuel's patronage as well as of those around him has been thoroughly researched by Paul Macavino and others. So now I will turn to Isaac Comnenus, long known as the black sheep of the Comnenian family, whose career stands in stark contrast to that of his parents, brothers, and sisters. He was porphyrogenitus and sebastocrator. As the third son of Emperor Alexius I, as brother of Emperor John II, and as uncle of Manuel I, Isaac had steady, lifelong connections to the imperial court, such as few other individuals can possibly have enjoyed. Yet Isaac, as we will see, spent much of his adult life in exile. His career is well known and lively as it is. I will only summarize it here. When their father Alexius I lay dying in 1118, a struggle over the succession ensued. Anna and her husband versus their brother John. Anna lost out, and John became emperor with the support of his brother Isaac. Isaac and John II then had an unspecified falling out, a microlipia, say this text, apparently in 1122, as a consequence of which Isaac left the capital and began many years of roaming from foreign court to foreign court in Asia Minor, trying to muster support for his goal of replacing John II on the throne. And we were told that he went to the Danishment Emir in Melitini, to the Seljuk Sultan in Konya, to the Armenian king in Cilicia, to the prince of the Gavras family that then ruled Trebizond, and to Fulk of Anjou, the Latin king of Jerusalem. I think I can do it backwards. There's Melitini, Trebizond is up there, Konya is there, and Cilician Armenia is there, and Jerusalem is down there. In short, he knew firsthand, as we would say, all the major players of his time. He seems to have been received cordially enough in these courts, since, as the chronicler Coniati says, he was most imperial in bearing and a member of a most distinguished family. But John II's military advances in Asia Minor, aimed at returning these very territories to Byzantine hands, persuaded these rulers to tread carefully, and Isaac's efforts failed. Though reconciled with his family in 1138, Isaac seems to have resumed his subversive activities, for in 1140, John banished him to Heraclea Pontiki on the Black Sea, which is just under there. He was released from there in 1143 by the new emperor, Isaac's nephew, Manuel I, but in 1150, Manuel exiled Isaac once more and for all to Thrace, near what is now the border between Greece and Turkey, and it's unlikely that he ever returned to Constantinople. Usually assigned to the earlier period was Isaac's restoration of the Church of the Chora, Kaliajami, in Constantinople, a monastic church that had once belonged to his grandmother. Surviving from the 12th century are the naos with its dome and parts of the apse. The rest belongs to the vast re-renovation of the church that took place 2 centuries later in the early 14th century. Isaac's work at the core apparently included setting up a rather elaborate tomb for himself, with marble slabs, brass railings, and panel portraits of his parents, Alexius and Irene, plus a portrait of himself. Then he fled town. At some point during his long period of wandering, Isaac visited the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and other Holy Land sites, among them the monastery of St. John the Baptist, near the presumed site of Christ's baptism on the Jordan River. There, Isaac had an aqueduct built to convey spring water to a cistern in the monastery. And not a major project, for sure, but an interesting one, in that the monastery he was helping was, of course, not in Constantinople at all, not even in Byzantine territory, but in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, to whose king he had appealed for help in overthrowing John II. An interesting precedent for the more politically motivated building initiatives undertaken by Isaac's nephew Manuel I in the area in the 1160s. And there's another work, which we may just possibly be able to associate with this period of Isaac's life. And this is a manuscript containing the homilies of the church father Gregory of Nazianzus, now in the library of the monastery of St. John or Patmos. Facing the opening words of Gregory's first sermon on Easter is a fine frontispiece miniature of the Anastasis, or Resurrection of Christ. The miniature dates to the time of the manuscript, that is, the late 11th century. But on the reverse of this folio is a dedicatory inscription written in the form of a cross, whose letters, very faded, were inked over by a later hand who failed in many cases to read the original letters correctly. An examination of the inscription under ultraviolet light revealed a name, that of the Panephtihestatos, or most fortunate Isaac, Komninos Sebastokrator, who was donating the manuscript to the monastery of St. Sabas, located outside of Jerusalem. A little awkward from this position, but if you can see the underneath, you can see a sort of a couple of A's and a K and an omega, and then this is the Ftihestatos. I don't know how they did it. And so there's a Komnino there too. So this is not sure at all, but it's hard to know who else it would have been given the names. And that same unpronounceable word is used a lot in the circles back in Constantinople. If this is indeed our Isaac, this manuscript can plausibly be seen as another act of patronage from the period of Isaac's travels in the Holy Land. And another work associated with Isaac, this one is an entirely new undertaking, not just the addition of gems or a name or a poetic dedication to an already extant work, as was the norm for his generation. This is the so-called Octateuch of the Seraglio, well known to John, a richly illuminated manuscript containing the first 8 books of the Bible, that is, from Genesis to the Book of Ruth, complete with commentary. It's housed today in Topkapi, in the library of the former Sultan's Palace in Istanbul. The miniatures, and there were to be nearly 300 of them, are inserted into the Bible text, which is itself surrounded by commentaries on the Bible by a range of church fathers. Our knowledge of Isaac's involvement with this, which is the largest of all surviving Byzantine Octateuch manuscripts, I'll just show you a couple more pages of the better miniatures here. Then you get one of these. So his involvement is based on the title to a short text that was added at the very beginning of the manuscript. This text, a paraphrase of the so-called Letter of Aristeas, was composed according to its nearly effaced title by the Porphyrogenitos. I think I'm hitting it here. The Porphyrogenitos, son of the great Emperor Lord Alexius Komnenos. And this, for various reasons, can only be our Isaac. The Architect is not dated, but probably belongs to the later period of Isaac's career, that is, the 1140s, after he had been released by Manuel. For one of the artists involved in the illumination of the Architect of the Seraglio belonged to a workshop in Constantinople that was responsible for the illustration of a number of other important manuscripts, including the Gospel book I showed earlier that had the portraits of John II and his son Alexius, and the illustrated homilies of the writer James Kokkinovafos. And I show you several pictures there, comparing that to the Gospel book. The Kokkinovafos manuscripts are generally thought to date around the second quarter of the 12th century, which gives us a rough, but not in our case very useful, time frame for the Architect miniatures. Certainly Isaac's access to the Kokkinovafos master, who had worked for John II and would work for John's widowed daughter-in-law, Irene de Sebastokratorisa, for it was for her that these particular homily manuscripts were made, indicates that Isaac was back in court circles in Constantinople at the time of its production and had access to a full amount of resources. Other Architects were being produced around the same time and even illustrated in part by the same Kokkinovafos master, which speaks for Isaac's full integration into court activities at the time, although what prompted this interest in Architects in general is something that needs further explanation. But interesting enough, his project floundered. A fair number of the miniatures in the Seraglio Architect were never finished, and 86 of them were never even started. They were laid out, that is, and that's an unfinished one. And others were laid out but not executed, giving us the impression that the project had to be abandoned. And all this is well known. Lots of people, Kelly Leonardo and John, have worked on these. In the early 1150s, Isaac was banished to Thrace, where he became involved in an ambitious and costly project, namely the establishment of a grand monastery on lands that had been given to him by his father Alexius long years before. And I just show you the town that he ended up in is there. It's called Ferai today. What you see here is the Evros River, which was the border between Greece and Turkey today. The monastery was dedicated to the Virgin Kosmosotira, that is, to the Virgin as Savior of the world. Happily for us, both the foundation document, the Typicon, survives, as does the monastery's church in the town of Ferai, sitting high on a hillside overlooking the fertile plain of the Evros Valley, river delta really. Old photo that doesn't make it look very fertile, and a little better one when it's green. We learned that from the Typicon that it was to be a hospital, places for burials, a mill, a bathhouse, bridges and an aqueduct, and residences for himself and for his retainers. This is a sort of hypothetical plan of the whole monastic complex. Isaac says he has given the monastery all his family property. It was to receive his books and writings at his death and to house his tomb, the furnishings of which he requested be removed from Courtauld Monastery in Constantinople and brought to Thrace. His withdrawal from Constantinople was complete. The church is a recognizably Comnenian structure with close connections to contemporary Constantinopolitan architecture, especially the churches of the Pantocrator Monastery. Its main dome is very large indeed, 7 meters in diameter, as large as that of the dome in Cora, as large as the central dome of the Pantocrator. There is nothing remotely like this church in size or style anywhere in the area. And indeed, with its considerable social services as well as its architecture, the Church of the Virgin Kosmosotira at Ferai would have been completely at home among his family's foundations in Constantinople. The interior is adorned with frescoes of good quality, though as you can see today in poor condition. They include all the regular elements of a provincial Byzantine fresco program, from gospel scenes, which are not depicted here, to the hierarchy of holy figures descending from Old Testament patriarchs placed at the very top of the side walls, to prophets, to military martyrs, to celebrant bishops. In the Typicon, Isaac speaks of importing marbles for the church and of a mosaic image of the death of the Virgin placed high on the west wall of the interior, but does not mention frescoes. And I suspect that the fresco decoration was a sort of plan B, if, as is likely, Isaac's grand dreams, of which he had many, of obtaining marble sheathing for the vast interior walls failed to materialize. At any rate, the frescoes do not fit the architecture, which was quite clearly not designed with them in mind. In many ways, then, Isaac was both a typical and an atypical comedian. He had been given and still owned properties not far from the capital, from which he could draw revenue throughout his life. When in the good graces of the empress, he had access to and contributed to the cultural life of the court. He was acclaimed by the poets and in a position to hire the finest Constantinopolitan painters and architects. But in other ways, Isaac's career diverges from the comedian pattern. His sedition divided the family and threatened the very stability that the comedian empress was striving to achieve. In exile in Asia Minor, he was free to range far afield as an individual and must have acquired an unusual familiarity with the cultures of the various courts in which he took up temporary residence, cultures to which his imperial relatives were exposed primarily on the battlefield. Although I have to say that I have tried in vain to find reflections of all his foreign experiences in what has survived of his commissions, but I failed. Isaac was the only one in the comedian family before the accession of Manuel I in 1143 to have initiated any kind of building program outside the city of Constantinople. And this is, of course, no coincidence, given the story of his life. But it's significant that the establishment of a monastic institution on the scale of the Kosmosotira was never attempted by any other member of the family resident in the city. It was a quasi-imperial act, a commission outside the city that within the city itself only the emperor and his wife would have executed. Isaac, who dreamed of being an emperor himself, acted not as one of the many comedian children, but as an imperial patron himself, setting up a monastery where he could offer the surrounding population the many services that his imperial relatives offered the city.